Continuing from the Judaism meets Hellenism section of Solomon Zeitlin's The Rise and Fall of the Judean State. Volume 1, Chapter 3, Judah Makkabbe. Mattathias the Hasmonean. For a while it seemed as if Antiochus had triumphed over the Judeans, and that Hellenism would supersede Judaism. The situation was critical indeed. On the one hand, the Hellenistic party became the official party, helping Antiochus to execute his orders against the Judeans and Judaism ruthlessly. On the other hand, many of the Hasidim, Essenes, in brackets, went to death for their religion willingly. Most of the Hasidim, however, fled the country and took refuge in the desert and in caves so as not to profane their religion. This was a form of passive resistance. But such an attitude cannot long remain static. It finally developed into active resistance. A priest named Mattathias the Hasmonean, the son of John, Yohanan, of the priestly tribe of Yorib, who had fled from Jerusalem with his sons to the small town of Modin, became the leader of those who defied forcible Hellenization by Antiochus. While Mattathias was in Modin, the king's officers came to the town to force the people to sacrifice to idols. The officer of the king appealed directly to Mattathias and promised that, if he would conform with the king's orders, he would be honored and counted among the friends of the king. Mattathias refused, and, in reply to the officer, said that neither he nor his family would forsake the Judean law. A Judean who was present came forth and offered a sacrifice on the altar in accordance with the decree of the king. Mattathias and his followers slew him and the officer. By this act, Mattathias raised the flag of revolt. He appealed to loyal Judeans to follow him, and he and his followers fled to the mountains and the deserts. Many Judeans followed him, and even the Hasidim joined him in his resistance to the enemy. The tragedy of the 1,000 men, women, and children who had been burned to death in a cave because they would not profane the Sabbath aroused the most intense indignation of Mattathias and his followers. He issued a statement permitting fighting in self-defense on the Sabbath, that we may not all die as our brothers did in the hiding places. He held that the Sabbath might be profaned to save human life. Mattathias organized a small band of guerrillas to harass the army of Antiochus. At night they fell upon the villages where altars had been erected and tore them down. They punished severely those Judeans who aided Antiochus's forces. They circumcised those who had not been circumcised because of the king's decree. They did this even when they had to use force. Mattathias died in the year 168 to 167, shortly after he had organized these guerrillas. He left a testament to his children, which we have in two versions, one given in 1 Maccabees and the other by Josephus. Probably neither is authentic, but Mattathias did leave a testament in which he urged the Judeans, particularly his sons, to fight against Antiochus and his hirelings. He had 5 sons: John, Yohanan, Simon, Judah, Eleazar, and Jonathan. According to both sources, he appointed Judah, who was called Makkabbe, to be the leader of the small group which was devoted to fighting the people's war. For counsel, he advised that they turn to Simon. Mattathias was buried in a small town of Modin, where he had begun the revolt. Judah's leadership. The name Makkabbe has been believed to be an acrostic of the Hebrew words which in translation mean, "Who is like unto thee among the gods, a Yahweh." Exodus 15:11. It has been surmised that these words were inscribed on Judah's standard. The view is untenable. Makkabbe is derived from the Hebrew word Makkabah, which means hammerhead. Judah was called the hammerhead because of the shape of his skull. The vogue of naming men according to physical characteristics was common in the Hellenistic world. Ptolemy, brother of Ptolemy Philometor, was called Physcon, fat, paunch. Another Ptolemy was called Kokes, scarlet, perhaps the red. Antiochus VIII, son of Demetrius II, was surnamed Grippus, hook-nose. Ptolemy, the son of Dorymenes, who was a general in the army of Antiochus IV, was called Macron, long-headed. Pliny the Elder tells us that Julius, the Roman dictator, received the surname Caesar because of the operation on his mother at his birth. The name became popular, and all his successors were called Caesar after the origin of the name that had been forgotten. Similarly, the surname Makkabbe became very popular. Probably the epitomist of Second Maccabees and Josephus did not know the meaning of the word Makkabbe and were unaware of the reason why it was bestowed upon Judah. After the death of Mattathias, Judah Makkabbe became the leader of a small group which his father had assembled to resist the Syrians and the oppressive decrees of Antiochus. The author of First Maccabees, in describing Judah, said, "He was like a lion in his deeds, like a lion's whelp roaring for his prey. He sought out and pursued those who broke the law and exterminated those who troubled his people." His brothers, including Simon, who was older than Judah, accepted his leadership, recognizing his great ability as a warrior and organizer. Simon served rather as a father to the brothers, and they sought his counsel. He demonstrated remarkable statesmanship from the beginning of the revolt until the establishment of the Free State of Judea, as will be noted below. When the revolt began, Judah had but a small group of followers. However, they were fanatics, ready to sacrifice their lives for Judaism and completely devoted to their leader, whom they considered to have been appointed by God. Their intense dedication proved to be an important factor in the struggle. At first, Judah did not engage the Syrians in direct warfare. He roamed the countryside, destroying the altars which had been erected by the decree of Antiochus and circumcising the children of the Judeans even against the protest of their parents. When the local governor, Apollonius, became aware of the growing revolt, he determined to wipe it out in its infancy. He apparently did not realize that Judah's band, though small, was well organized and consisted of determined and militant men, whose sole ambition was to fight the battles of God. In the engagement between Apollonius and Judah Makkabbe, the latter won a great victory, and Apollonius himself was killed. Judah Makkabbe took Apollonius's sword as spoil, and carried it henceforth in all the battles against his enemies, as a symbol of victory in the name of God. This first victory seems symbolic for Judah and his men. They became more resolute in the belief that ultimately they would be victorious. They were convinced that they would achieve their goal of freedom of worship of their God and the expulsion of paganism from Judea. After the Maccabees' victory over Apollonius, Seron, the governor of Syria, assembled a large army with which to crush the rebellion. Many Judeans who were opposed to Judah joined the Syrian army and marched with it to the ascent of Beit Horon, situated on the road to Jaffa, about 12 miles northwest of Jerusalem. There, for the first time, Judah Maccabees soldiers met an organized army. They were no match for the highly trained Syrians, but they fought for their lives and their religion, whereas the Syrian forces, being largely mercenaries, did not fight with the same zeal. Besides, Judah's men knew the terrain well, which gave them a natural advantage, and as a result they won an important victory. Seron's casualties numbered about 800, while the rest of his army fled to the coast. Judah Maccabee's victory over an organized army established him firmly as a leader. When Antiochus heard about the defeat of his general Seron, he felt it necessary to take more vigorous measures. He was, however, in a quandary, since word came to him that the Parthians in the upper lands, Babylonia, were also in revolt. Personal footnote. Very important point, often overlooked in certain circles. Guy had his hands full. End of footnote. He finally decided that he himself should lead an army against the Parthians, as there was more booty to be won from them. He appointed Lysias to lead an army against Judah Maccabee, and entrusted him his young son, Antiochus. His directions to Lysias were emphatic: assemble a large army and quell the revolt at any price. The king himself proceeded at the head of an army against the Parthians, crossing the river Euphrates in the spring of 166. Lysias, meanwhile, mustered the 3 best generals of the army: Ptolemy, the son of Doramenes, Nicanor, and Gorgias. Their force consisted of about 40,000 infantrymen and 7,000 cavalry. Lysias himself remained in Antioch to manage the affairs of the state. The crushing of the revolt seemed so certain that merchants from foreign countries joined the army, bringing with them fetters to chain the slaves whom they expected to purchase from the Syrians. Judah and his men, however, were not inactive, and this expedition did not take them by surprise. They knew that Antiochus would send a strong force against them, and had therefore assembled at Mizpah, which is about 8 miles northeast of Jerusalem, and had been a fortress and a center of prayer from the time of the judges. Judah now had a considerable army, which he organized according to military practice, under colonels, captains, lieutenants, and sergeants. But in accordance with the law of Moses, he ordered newly married men and those who had built new houses to return to their homes. This army was clearly not equal to the Syrian army, led by the 3 outstanding generals, so Judah endeavored to increase his followers' zeal by appealing to their religious feelings. He displayed scrolls of the Torah upon which Antiochus's men had drawn idols. He exhibited the priestly vestments to show them that the loyal priest could not serve God in the temple, since it had been defiled by Antiochus. These silent witnesses, summoned by Judah Maccabee, had a profound effect upon the soldiers and made them ready to die for their religion. After a day of fasting and blowing of the trumpets, he set his army in motion. It faced the Syrian host, encamped at Emmaus, later known as Nicopolis. about 22 miles west of Jerusalem on the road to Jaffa. Gorgias decided to make a sudden attack upon Judah Maccabee and crush him. With 5,000 infantrymen and 1,000 cavalrymen, he moved after nightfall toward Judah's encampment. Apparently, the Maccabee had spies in the Syrian army, and they informed him of Gorgias's plan. He set out during the night against the main body of the Syrian army. When Gorgias entered the Judean camp and found no one there, he thought Judah had fled to the mountains and pursued him. Judah, in the meantime, launched a surprise attack upon the remainder of the Syrian host. 3,000 were slain, and the rest fled to the plains of Judea. And as far away as the coast, Judah, realizing that a large part of Gorgias's army would soon be marching from the east against him, warned his men not to stop to collect spoils. Rather, he ordered them to set the Syrian camp afire. Gorgias's army, which had been marching all night, searching vainly for Judah and his men, returned at daybreak to its camp, finding it in flames, with Judah and his men there prepared for battle. Without venturing an attack, the Syrian army fled. Judah's victory was complete, and he now permitted his men to plunder and gather spoils. They found a particularly rich hoard because of the wealth which the merchants had brought in anticipation of buying the Judeans as slaves. Upon their return to Jerusalem, which was now open to them, the victors sang a song of thanksgiving. The words, "For he is good, for his mercy endureth forever." There can be no doubt that many of the songs which are now a part of the book of Psalms were compiled by the men of Judah Maccabee and their successors after their victories. Personal footnote: of course, such a statement could be highly debated as to the origins of these songs and the actual date of the Psalms' materialization themselves. End of personal footnote. Lysias, who was the guardian of Antiochus's son and pro tempore ruler, was greatly disturbed by the defeat. He recognized the serious consequences of the revolt if it was not crushed immediately, as it might spread to other parts of the Seleucid Empire. He therefore assembled a large army, 60,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and many elephants. The presence of the elephants, which in ancient times served the same purpose in battle as tanks do in modern warfare, indicates the gravity with which the Syrian government viewed the revolt. In the spring, or rather the early summer, of 165, Lysias launched his campaign against Judah Maccabee. He hoped for more than the crushing of this revolt. He aimed to make future uprisings impossible by converting Jerusalem into a truly Greek center, thus breaking the spirit of the Judeans entirely. He invaded not by way of the north, but from the south, by way of Idumea. The route took him along the coast, and to the south, bypassing the hilly regions, and eventuated in an encampment at Beit Zor, which lies about 20 miles south of Jerusalem toward Hebron. Judah Maccabee now could marshal a substantial army, but it was no match in numbers for the host of Lysias, as Judah had neither elephants nor cavalry. His men were, however, still superior in spirit and resolution, and he was victorious in the battle. According to the author of 1 Maccabees, about 5,000 Syrians were slain. The army was routed, and Lysias fled. This account of Lysias' departure as a flight must be challenged. Even if we accept as fact the statement that 5,000 Syrians were slain, this would not overwhelm an army of 60,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and a number of elephants. Indeed, Judah Maccabee's army lacked even the cavalry with which to counterattack the Syrian army. The real cause was almost certainly political, namely the premature death of Antiochus Epiphanes. He had met many defeats in the upper lands, and died there in the fall of 165. Before his death, he appointed Philip, one of his friends, as regent of the kingdom, and assigned to him the education of his little son, Antiochus. The sources do not indicate what caused Antiochus Epiphanes to change his trust from Lysias to Philip, but he had always been unpredictable. Philip led his army back to Syria to take over the government. Lysias, therefore, thought it more important to return to Antioch to stop Philip than to fight the Judeans. He could continue his campaign against them later. This was what led Lysias to offer peace to the Judeans. He invited them to send plenipotentiaries to present their demands. The Judeans sent 2 men named John and Absalom as their representatives. In the meantime, an official statement was issued by the boy king Antiochus to Lysias. It stated that his father had passed over to the gods, died, in brackets, and that as the Judeans did not agree with his father's plan to converting them to Hellenism, preferring their own mode of life, he would grant them their wish. Lysias, in another official letter to the Judeans, informed them that their demands had been brought to the attention of King Antiochus, surnamed Eupator. These letters by Lysias and King Antiochus were not addressed to Judah Maccabee, but to the Judeans and to the Gerousia, the Judean Senate. Lysias, who was compelled by political considerations to make concessions to the Judeans, thus granted them some religious freedom, but did not recognize Judah Maccabee as their leader. The Syrian government still regarded the high priest Onias Menelaus as the leader of the Judeans. Judah Maccabee, therefore, was ignored in the letters. Whether recognized by the Syrian government or not, Judah's victories had made him the real leader of the people. They believed his military prowess had brought about the withdrawal of Lysias's army from Judea, and the rank and file of the Judeans trusted him. Moreover, with the withdrawal of Lysias from Judea, no army of any consequence was left, except some soldiers and leaders of the Hellenistic party who held the citadel. Judah, with his small, well-organized army, dominated the country. The victory over the Syrians, for a time at least, was complete. Judah Maccabee now decided to restore the temple to the worship of the God of Israel. The origin of Hanukkah. On the 23rd day of the month of Heshvan, November, the Judeans tore down the soreg, latticed railing, in brackets, cast out the stones from the Azarah, the sanctuary, and destroyed the altars which the pagans had built in the temple. This day was later commemorated as a semi-holiday. On the 27th of the same month, the Judeans began to bring offerings of fine flour to the altar. This day, too, was declared a semi-holiday. They waited, however, until the 25th day of Kislev, December, for the formal rededication of the temple. They delayed until this day because it was on the 25th of Kislev, 168, that Antiochus Epiphanes had erected the abomination of desolation. in the sanctuary, and dedicated the temple to Zeus Olympius. That had been a day of the utmost humiliation for the Judeans. Now, 3 years later, the same day was to see a jubilant celebration of their brilliant victory. As the author of First Maccabees puts it, at the same time, on the same day on which the heathen profaned it, on that very day it was consecrated with songs and harps and lutes and with cymbals. Yet, in order to prevent the Syrians and Hellenistic Judeans from launching an attack upon the temple during its cleaning, Judah Maccabee had to station men to guard it. The altar, the sacred garments, the table, and the curtains were all replaced by new ones. Sacrifices were offered to God, prayers were uttered, and psalms were sung. Psalm 30, of the dedication of the house, was probably composed for and sung on this occasion. Other parts of our Psalter were also probably composed during the Hasmonean period. The Judeans also celebrated their victory in another more spectacular manner, parading through the streets with torches. For this reason, Hanukkah received the additional name, the Festival of Lights, though it may also derive from another source. A legend tells that when the first temple was destroyed, the sacred altar fire was hidden by Jeremiah in a cave. It was later discovered by the priest at the time of Ezra, and was brought to the altar. The reason this was so important was that according to the Pentateuchal law, the Judeans were not allowed to light a new altar fire for the temple. Such a fire would be considered a foreign fire, rather than the flame which was supposed to be kept burning perpetually. But if one poured naphtha on the altar, it would burst into flame spontaneously. The people would then consider it a fire which had come from heaven. Naphtha, spelled N-A-P-H-T-H-A. It is reasonable to assume that this was what Ezra did, and so to Judah Maccabee. Hence the name Festival of Lights. In later days, when the origin of the name Festival of Lights no longer was recalled, another legend grew up. It related that when Judah entered the temple, he found there a cruet of oil, sealed with the seal of the high priest, containing enough oil to burn 1 day, but that by a miracle it burned 8 days. This legend came into being to explain why the Jews kindle lights on the festival of Hanukkah, which is a celebration of a dedication, and why it is celebrated for 8 days. The rededication of the altar and the purification of the temple were celebrated for 8 days. Although Moses celebrated the dedication of the tabernacle, and Solomon and Ezra that of the temple for 7 days, Judah Maccabee did not follow their example in the number of days, because he had not built a new temple, as they had. He had purified the temple, and therefore followed the precedent of King Hezekiah, who celebrated for 8 days the reconsecration of the temple, which his father, King Ahaz, had defiled. With the consent of Judah and the leaders, and by a vote by the people, the 8 days beginning with the 25th of Kislev were declared a holiday, Hanukkah, a dedication, and it was decreed that they be thus celebrated each year. Appian states that the Roman Senate rejoiced when it received the news of the death of Antiochus IV. It saw in him a man determined to thwart the Roman ambition to penetrate into the eastern Mediterranean coast, and it was glad to be rid of him. The Judeans also had reason to rejoice. Of the Seleucid monarchs, he was the only one who strove to make the empire homogeneous, and therefore felt compelled to destroy Judaism. The Judeans had suffered more under his rule than had any other group in the Middle East, because they were the only ones who were dedicated monotheists. When Lysias was compelled to abandon Judea and to return to Antioch, no Syrian army was left in Judea except the garrison in the citadel. Judah Maccabee and his followers now became the de facto rulers. In order to strengthen his position in the south, which offered an easy threat to Jerusalem, he made war on the Idumeans and crushed them. He also made war on the Baians, who had been ambushing the Judeans on the highways. Later, he crossed the Jordan and attacked the Ammonites, defeated them, and captured the city of Jazer. After the purification of the temple, he built towers and a wall around Mount Zion, stationing there a garrison to guard against invasion. He also fortified Bet-zur, the key to Jerusalem from the south. Wars against neighboring states. The dedication of the temple and the restoration of the worship of the God of Israel gave courage to the Judeans who lived outside of Judea proper, in Galilee and Gilead, to reject Hellenization and the worship of the king. As a result of this, the heathens began to hate the Judeans who lived amongst them. They considered them disloyal, even traitors to their city and to the state for refusing to participate in the pagan civic celebrations. Their hatred was so intense that they contemplated destroying them entirely. Thus, in the village of Tobias, all the Judeans were put to death by the heathens. The Judeans of Gilead, which lies east of the Jordan between the Yarmuk River to the north and the river Arnon to the south, sent messengers to Judah Maccabee for help. At the same time, messengers came from Galilee, informing Judah and his followers that the heathens in Ptolemais, Tyre, Sidon, and all Upper Galilee had gathered to destroy them. Judah and the people were faced with a difficult decision. In Judea itself, the situation was insecure because the Syrians, who were still in the citadel, assisted those in sympathy with Hellenism. Yet he was asked to weaken his small army so as to go to the aid of his brethren in the east and the north. The latter was not only a question of strategy, but of principle, whether to engage in an offensive war by sending an army outside the borders of Judea. A Knesset, Haggadah, a great synagogue, which he called, decided to aid the Judeans of Gilead and Galilee. It directed Simon to go to Galilee, Judah and his brother Jonathan to go to Gilead, and other officers, Joseph and Azariah, to protect Judea. Simon went to Galilee with 3,000 men, engaged the heathens in many battles, and won brilliant victories. Gathering together the Judean settlers, their wives, and their children, he brought them and their belongings to Judea. It would thus appear that there had not been many Judeans in Upper Galilee. Judah Maccabee and his brother Jonathan, with 8,000 men, crossed the Jordan to aid the Judeans in Gilead. Not all the heathens in Transjordan were hostile to the Judeans. The Nabateans were friendly to them. In part, this was because they were a Semitic people and spoke Aramaic, a language cognate to the Hebrew spoken by the Judeans. It is also true that the Nabateans had been less affected by the Hellenistic culture than the other peoples of Transjordan. They even guided Judah's expedition in his war. The inhabitants of Beit Shean, Scythopolis, which lies on the west side of the Jordan, were also friendly to their fellow Judeans in the city, and Judah thanked them for their goodwill. He learned that many Judeans had been shut up in Bosora and Karnaim, and that in other fortresses they were doomed to die. He engaged the native tribes, subdued them, captured the fortresses, and put many to death. He met a well-organized army under the leadership of General Timotheus, northeast of the Jordan, and defeated it near a tributary of the Yarmouk River. The enemy fled to the city of Karnaim and took refuge in the great fortress temple dedicated to the Syrian goddess Atargatis. Judah took the city by storm and burned the temple, the refugees perishing in the flames. Timotheus succeeded in escaping, fled across the country, and found safety in Gaza. Judah Maccabee, like his brother Simon, then assembled all the Judeans who lived in Gilead, their wives, their children, and their belongings, and led them to Judea. In his march, he had to pass through the city of Ephraim, situated east of Bet-shean, in the valley between Ashtaroth and the Jordan. He asked the inhabitants to permit him to pass through the city. They refused to do so and blocked the gates. Since it was impossible for him to turn either to the right or to the left, he repeated his request. They again refused. He therefore stormed the city, burned it, and killed the inhabitants. He then crossed the Jordan opposite Scythopolis, where he found the Judeans living in peace with their neighbors. They were satisfied to remain where they were, and he had no reason to disturb them. Judah then marched to Jerusalem in time to celebrate the festival of unleavened bread. The expeditions of Judah Maccabee and Simon were concluded in the spring of 164, and they returned home with many Judeans who had been living in Gilead and Galilee. Throughout their long march to Jerusalem, they sang hymns of thanksgiving to God for their victorious return. It must be emphasized that in all this, neither Judah nor Simon had any idea of conquering these territories. Their whole purpose had been to save their brethren from annihilation. Joseph and Azariah, who directed the affairs of Judea in the absence of Judah Maccabee and Simon, undertook a military expedition against the city of Jamnia, but were routed with heavy losses. First Maccabees explains the defeat as being due to the fact that these two leaders were not Hasmoneans, to whom God had entrusted the saving of Israel. Josephus, whose account follows First Maccabees, makes the explanation more personal. He ascribes the defeat to the fact that the officials did not obey the orders of Judah. Judah Maccabee was not only skilled as a leader of guerrilla warfare, but as a strategist and statesman as well. He now faced a series of interlocking problems. He realized that the concessions made by Lysias in the name of Antiochus's Eupator were made under duress and would not be lasting. The Syrians would almost certainly launch their expedition from the south by way of the coast, where lived the Philistines and the Idumeans, both hostile to Judea. Moreover, the Judeans were not united in support of him. A segment remained who opposed him and favored the policies of the Seleucids. Judah, who ruled the country with an iron hand, determined to punish those who were pro-Seleucid and had favored the Hellenization of the Judeans. He organized a special court known as the Beit Din of the Hasmoneans to try them. Many, therefore, fled and took refuge among the Idumeans. His desire to pursue them and his need to neutralize both the south and the coast of the Mediterranean now coincided. As a result, he marched south and captured the city of Hebron in Idumea, which was where David first became king and which was originally part of Judea. He then marched to the coast, taking the city of Marissa on the way to Ashdod. The later city he destroyed, burning the altars and the carved images of pagan deities. He also ravaged the harbors of Jaffa and Jamnia, destroying the wharves and the ships. When Judah set out for Idumea and the coast, he left Simon, Joseph, and Zacchae with sufficient troops to carry on a siege against some other fortresses. Simon's men were bribed by some of the Idumeans and the refugees, and they allowed them to break through to safety. When Judah heard of this, he assembled the rulers of the people and accused those who had accepted the bribes of treason. There is no law in the Pentateuch or in the oral law which says that soldiers who have taken bribes from enemies of the state should be put to death. Yet these men were executed by the verdict of the court assembled by Judah. This point is worth discussion. Perhaps you'd like to take part of that in the comments section. A lot can be said for that. I would just say, are you kidding me? Executing traitors? Anyway, carrying on. The summoning of the leaders of the people to try the traitors indicates that, as yet, there was no permanent state court, as there already was for religious law. This civil court was called into session by the rulers from time to time when the necessity arose. Judah Makkabbe returned to Judea rich in spoils. He had now taken the offensive, making war on the heathens outside of Judea. Since the earlier expeditions into Gilead and Galilee were sanctioned by the Knesset, Haggadah, great synagogue, Judah felt justified in attacking Idumea and the cities on the coast. Still, the expeditions were for the purpose of protecting Judea, not for conquest. It may be that he had another aim, to impress the Antiochian court with his power. The Seleucids regarded him as a rebel. Menelaus was the recognized high priest and leader of the Judeans. Judah may have thought that through his great successes over the neighboring nations, he would obtain some lasting concessions from Lysias and possibly come to terms with the Seleucid rulers. Lysias's second expedition. It became extremely important for Judah Makkabbe to capture the citadel where Onias, Menelaus, and the Syrian garrison were stationed. He determined either to drive out the garrison and their fellow Judeans or to kill them. He constructed siege engines to storm the citadel, but Onias, Menelaus, and many of his followers succeeded in escaping. They went to Antioch to complain to the boy king and Lysias that they had neglected to assist them. They declared that they had been enduring hardships for the sake of the king and were suffering because they had followed the decrees of King Antiochus Epiphanes. They warned that the citadel was in danger of being captured and the garrison annihilated by Judah Makkabbe unless help came soon. They added that the entire country would be in the hands of the Maccabees' men unless you stop them at once. They will do more than this, and you will not be able to check them. The complaints of Menelaus and his followers produced the desired effect. Lysias was empowered to conduct an invasion of Judea and destroy Judah and his followers. He mustered a powerful army of 100,000 in infantry, 20,000 cavalry, and 32 elephants well trained for war. The elephants were distributed among the phalanxes, and 1,000 men with chain armor, plus 500 cavalry accompanied each beast. A wooden tower, occupied by 2 officers, was placed upon each elephant. The rest of the cavalry were arrayed in each side of the 2 flanks of the army. Lysias himself, together with the boy king, led the army. This expedition took place in 150 of the Seleucid era, probably in the spring of 163. Lysias took the southern route, as expected, and made his way easily through Idumea. Apparently, all the efforts of Judah Maccabee to subdue the Idumeans and the inhabitants of the coast did not hamper Lysias seriously in his march against Judea. He besieged Bet-zur, whose inhabitants fought valiantly against the Syrians. Due to the fact that it was a sabbatical year, from the fall of 164 to the fall of 163, the people of Bet-zur lacked food and came to terms with Lysias. Judah Maccabee was now compelled to raise the siege of the citadel. He assembled his men to meet Lysias at Bet-Zechariah, which lies southwest of Jerusalem. Despite years of campaigning and seasoning, his army, he knew, was no match for the Syrian troops. He had no cavalry nor elephants. He could not afford to attack directly, but neither could he simply stand his ground and win by a strong defense. He had to employ hit-and-run tactics to weaken the morale of the enemy. The military success of the Maccabee Hitherto had been due to his army's morale, its knowledge of the topography of Judea, his ingenious use of guerrilla tactics, and superior intelligence about enemy troops and movements. It was the latter he depended on this time. He learned from his spies that the boy king, Antiochus Eupator, was with the army and seated on one of the elephants. He believed that if the boy king were killed, the Syrian army would lose the will to fight. Judah's brother, Eleazar, noticed that one elephant was armed with royal breastplates, and he believed that the boy king was on it. He courageously crept forward, stabbed the elephant from behind, and was crushed to death under the weight of its body. With the attempt to kill the boy king unsuccessful, Judah realized that he had to retreat. He proceeded to Jerusalem and took refuge in the temple. Lysias made certain of Bet-zur by placing a garrison there and marched against Jerusalem. He laid siege to the temple for many days. Judah's followers fought courageously, but without success. After many days, most of the defenders left the temple to search for food in the countryside, Jerusalem, too, being short of provisions because of the sabbatical year. It now seemed as if all that Judah Maccabee had achieved on the field of battle against the Syrians had been in vain, and all his plans were to be frustrated. Events in Antioch again rescued him from total defeat. Lysias received word that Philip, whom Antiochus Epiphanes at his death had appointed regent and entrusted with the tutorship of his young son, had marched to Antioch. Lysias was again compelled to make peace with Judah in order to save his rule. He granted full religious freedom to the Judeans in the name of Antiochus V, permitting them to observe all their laws. He appointed a certain Hegemonides governor of Coel, Syria, to replace Gorgias, a friendly gesture to the Judeans who had suffered greatly from the expeditions led by Gorgias. To please the Judeans further, he removed Onias Menelaus from the high priesthood and took him away prisoner. Though he did not appoint Judah Maccabee as high priest, the governor of Judea, finally, before leaving Jerusalem, Lysias ordered that the walls encircling Mount Zion be torn down, thus demonstrating the sovereignty of Syria over Judea. Judah and the Judeans, who had been besieged in Mount Zion, did not know why Lysias sued for peace. They thought that the Syrians had been defeated and thus declared the day when Antiochus V withdrew from Jerusalem a semi-holiday. To this, the Megillat Tanit refers when it says, on the 28th of Shebat, Antiochus withdraw from Jerusalem. Not all the Syrians were happy about the agreement which Lysias had made with Judah. For example, deep animosity apparently existed between the people of Ptolemais and the Judeans. When Lysias came there, the citizens expressed their fury over the terms and demanded they be voided. Lysias had to defend the treaty by giving his reasons for it. This won over the people, and he then departed for Antioch. In the city of Berea, modern Aleppo, Lysias ordered Onias Menelaus executed by suffocation in a pit of ashes. The execution was intended to show that the king was interested in peace with Judeans. It showed more. Death by suffocation was inflicted upon offenders against religion or the state. Lysias apparently attributed the misfortunes of his expedition to Onias Menelaus's misguiding policy. Alcimus, who was probably the brother of Onias Menelaus, was appointed high priest. When Lysias arrived in Antioch, he found that Philip had himself crowned. In the ensuing battle between them, Lysias was victorious and Philip was taken captive and killed. Personal footnote. Yeah, let us know in the comments section what you think of that idea, that Alcimus was probably Menelaus's brother, right? They throw his brother in a pit of ashes, right? And then say, okay, you can be king. Yeah, like, what do you think of that? I think I'll bite my tongue on that one. But anyway, moving along. Antiochus V's granting of full religious freedom to the Judeans brought about a change among Judah Maccabbe's followers. Many of the Hasidim had originally been persuaded to join the Hasmoneans to fight for the right to observe Judaism. They became the backbone of Judah's army and fought fanatically against the Syrians. When religious freedom was granted to the Judeans, the Hasidim no longer saw any reason for continuing their military service, and they left the army. On the other hand, many Judeans who originally had not joined him, who, being defeatists, had not believed in the possibility of his success, but had feared the revolt would only bring more misery to the land, now accepted his leadership. Although officially, Alcimus was the high priest and representative of the Syrian government, he was not recognized as high priest and ruler by the followers of the Hasmoneans. Judah Maccabbe was the de facto ruler of the Judean masses. He continued to organize his followers and to persecute the Judeans who still inclined to Hellenization. Alcimus, the high priest, and his followers probably brought complaints before Lysias about Judah, but Lysias's own position was insecure. Despite his victory over Philip, there were circumstances which made him uneasy and required the concentration of his army at home. The chief of these was the attitude of Rome. Octavius, the head of the mission, which the Roman Senate sent to supervise the application of the treaty made after the defeat of Antiochus III at Magnesia, was assassinated by a Syrian Greek. Lysias accorded Octavius a sumptuous funeral and sent an embassy to Rome to impress upon the Senate that his government was not to blame for the murder. The Senate, however, refused to receive the embassy and reserved judgment. In addition, Lysias had to reckon with the fact that there was a legitimate pretender to the Syrian throne in Rome. Demetrius, the son of Seleucus IV, had appeared before the Senate on several occasions to present his claim to the throne of Syria. Lysias had reason to worry. He therefore could not afford to send another expedition into Judea, but kept his pledge to Judah Maccabbe and the Judeans. The high priest, Alcimus, and Demetrius I. Demetrius now took matters into his own hands. When his father, Seleucus IV, had been assassinated, Rome had not permitted him to return home. When he had learned of the death of his uncle, Antiochus IV, he again asked the Senate to release him, and he was again refused. Rome was interested in having a young and weak king on the throne, even an unpopular government, rather than Demetrius, who was young, enterprising, and ambitious. The murder of Octavius and the disturbance which prevailed in Syria encouraged Demetrius and some of his friends to escape from Rome. He did so with the aid of his friend, the historian Polybius, in the early part of the summer of 162. Demetrius debarked at Tripoli, which is north of Sidon, or Sidon. The people of Syria rallied to him, as did the army, which is the most likely reason that there was no strong opposition to him. The boy king and the regent Lysias were put to death, but Timarchus, a Babylonian general who had been a favorite of Antiochus Epiphanes, felt no allegiance to Demetrius. He revolted and declared himself king of Babylonia and Media. Rome, pursuing her policy of division, recognized Timarchus. In the summer of 162, the high priest Alcimus, at the head of the delegation, brought a formal complaint to Demetrius about Judah Maccabbe. Judah and his brothers were charged with killing or driving out of the country many who were friendly to the Seleucid dynasty. Since Alcimus followed the policy of Onias Menelaus in holding that Judea was an integral part of the Seleucid Empire, Judah and his brothers were called traitors to the state. Demetrius naturally was impressed by the charges of the delegation and appointed Bacchides, one of his friends, to march to Judea to drive Judah and his followers out and to reinstate Alcimus as the high priest. Many of the Hasidim who had followed Judah previously now joined Bacchides, particularly since he had sworn to Alcimus not to interfere in the religious life of Judea. Bacchides, spelt Bacchides in its English transliteration. They also had faith in Alcimus since he was of the family of the high priests. But the friendly relations between the Hasidim and Alcimus did not last long. Bacchides ordered 60 of the Hasidim killed for reasons that are unknown. Perhaps Alcimus suspected that these 60 had assisted Judah in persecuting those who favored Onias Menelaus, and hence doubted their loyalty to himself. Still, the Hasidim as a whole did not rally to Judah Maccabbe. He was left with only a small group and could not hazard an open battle with Bacchides. He therefore left Jerusalem and went into the country. Bacchides, thinking that he had succeeded in restoring Syrian control, returned to Antioch. He left a small military force behind to protect Alcimus and supervise the affairs of Judea. While Bacchides was in Judea, Timarchus was advancing on Antioch from Babylonia. In the battle which followed, Timarchus was defeated and put to death. Rome, which had recognized him as the king of Babylonia, did not come to his assistance, testifying to her purely expedient interest in his rule. Demetrius was now acclaimed Soter, the Savior. Nicanor and the death of Judah Maccabbe. While Bacchides was in Judea, Alcimus could sustain his position, but when the general left, Judah again became the master because the rank and file of the people were on his side. Alcimus saw that he could not maintain his high priestly position without the support of the king. In the year 162 to 161, he again went to Antioch to plead with the king to suppress Judah and his followers. He charged them with being warmongers and revolutionaries who not only wanted to deprive him of his high priesthood, which was his ancestral glory, but were also opposed to the king and were harming the country economically. Nicanor and the death of Judah Maccabbe. While Bacchides was in Judea, Alcimus could sustain his position, but when the general left, Judah again became the master because the rank and file of the people were on his side. Alcimus saw that he could not maintain his high priestly position without the support of the king. Moving forward. Demetrius called a Sanhedrin, a military council. That's pronounced Synedrion, spelt in the transliteration Synedrion. Synedrion. I don't know if that's the same pronunciation as Sanhedrin. Let us know in the comments if you happen to know. Demetrius called a Synedrion a military council in which he was decided to assist Alcimus. A strong force was dispatched, with Nicanor, general of the Elephant Corps, as commander-in-chief. Nicanor sought to crush the revolt without engaging Judah Makkabbe. He tried to capture him by a ruse, thinking that this would cause the revolt to collapse. Judah saw through the device, and Nicanor's plan came to naught. In an engagement of the advance guard of the Syrian army with Judah's men, which took place in Kafar Salama, about 6 miles north of Jerusalem, Nicanor's army was routed. It took refuge in the citadel. Nicanor was outraged, and he went up to Mount Zion, demanding the delivery of Judah Makkabbe, dead or alive. He threatened to destroy the temple if the priest did not hand him over, and even executed some of the leaders in Jerusalem who were suspected of having fought on Judah's side. When Nicanor learned that Judah and his followers were in the northern part of Judea, not far from Samaria, he marched his army northward from Kafar Salama to find him. Many Judeans were part of Nicanor's force. When Nicanor, in pursuing Judah, ordered his army to march on the Sabbath day, the Judeans begged him not to require them to profane the Sabbath. Nicanor thought this request ridiculous, and not only scornfully declined to grant it, but scoffed at their belief that there was a sovereign who ordered them to rest on the 7th day. He said that King Demetrius and he were their only sovereigns. Some Jewish defection followed. Nicanor encamped at Bet Horon, which is about 12 miles northwest of Jerusalem. He remained there, either because he wanted to reorganize his army or to await reinforcements from Syria. Judah, meanwhile, marched southward and encamped in Adasa, a village about 7 miles from Bet Horon. Though he had only 3,000 men, he surprised Nicanor's army and decisively defeated it. Nicanor himself was slain, and the Syrian army fled, pursued by Judah's men. Nicanor's head and right hand were cut off and brought to Jerusalem, as a punishment for his blasphemy in threatening to destroy the temple. The victory over Nicanor occurred on the 13th day of the first month of Adar, in the year 161. This day was declared as a holiday to be observed annually under the name of Nicanor's Day. Judah Makkabbe was fully aware that Demetrius would not remain passive towards his revolt against the Syrians. He also knew that Rome had taken an interest in the affairs of the eastern Mediterranean after the Battle of Magnesia, and that her policy was to tolerate no strong power in that area. Judah therefore sent 2 Judeans, Eupolemus and Jason, to Rome to conclude a treaty of friendship. The envoys spoke in the name of Judah Makkabbe, his brothers, and the Judeans, asking the Senate to effect a treaty of peace with them, and promising that the Judeans would be enrolled as allies and friends of Rome. The Romans agreed and ratified a treaty of friendship, but not a treaty of alliance. A Foedus, spelled Foedus, as Judea, was not yet an independent state. By this treaty, which First Maccabees says was engraved on brass tablets, it was agreed that both people should live at peace with each other. It further stipulated that, in the event that Rome should be engaged in any war, the Judeans would fight on their side as friends, and that Rome would assist the Judeans if a similar occasion arose from them. The Senate also informed the ambassadors that they had written to Demetrius asking him to desist from hostile acts against the Judeans on pain of war with Rome. Demetrius, on learning of the defeat of his general Nicanor, proceeded energetically to plan the overthrow of Judah Maccabee before there could be any possible interference on the part of Rome. He ordered Bacchides to assemble an army and march against Judah. He did so in Nisan 161, less than 7 weeks after the defeat of Nicanor. Bacchides' army consisted of 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. Judah could muster only 3,000 men. Many who had fought with him in the early days now deserted him because they could see no reason for continuing the revolt against the Seleucids. The superiority of Bacchides' army was so overwhelming that many of Judah's followers despaired and deserted, until only the most fanatical and most personally devoted followers, numbering about 800, remained with him. Although he knew he had no chance of victory, he engaged Bacchides' army about 10 miles north of Jerusalem. He was victorious in the early part of the battle. The right wing of Bacchides' army gave way and fled, but the left wing wheeled around Judah's men and hewed them down. Judah himself was killed in the battle. His brothers, Jonathan and Simon, who were with him, apparently snatched his body before Bacchides' men were able to seize it. They buried him in the sepulchre of his father in the city of Modin.